Hey everybody. Today we're going to be talking about a very controversial subject matter, so hopefully you guys can bear with me through that. Um, yeah, you guys don't know yet, but that's funny because we're going to be talking about bears, and I said bear with me through. The jokes are for me. Anyways, so today I wanted to talk about black bear hunting specifically in southern Appalachia. The reason I wanted to basically kind of narrowly look at just this region and just this species of bear is because one, black bear ranges traditionally, historically, have taken up basically all of the North American continent. From Alaska through Canada, all lower, probably 47 of the lower 48 states. I think Utah's an outlier. Um, just because of something or another. But down into Mexico, the black bear range was historically massive. It still is to this modern day. I think they are in 40 of the 50 states in the United States, Alaska being included, and then kind of spread through the mountain chains and a little bit on the coast and stuff like that, and all throughout Canada still. And what this means, though, is that with such a wide range of these animals, the cultural practices of not only indigenous peoples prior to European contact, but also Europeans when they colonized the North American continent, all the way up to through settler communities up to our modern day. The traditions around and the practices around hunting bears and the value of those bears changes from culture to culture and area to area. And so rather than try and cover so much nuance for all these different regions and all these different practices and all these different values held by so many different groups, I thought it would be better to geolocate it to this area specifically that I live in and focus on the history that I know really well because I'm studying it and have worked extensively studying it. And the other thing that I like about it, and we're going to get into this a little bit more, but is like this is the famous history of bear hunting. It's here in North Carolina and Tennessee in the mountains in this area because this is where Daniel Boone became famous for being a market hunter, bear hunter. Right. Later on, he would discover Kentucky and become famous for that. The legends around him stem from bear hunting in this area, in these mountains. The Cherokee obviously are the historical owners of this area, people who have traditionally been here, and they're famous with their bear hunting traditions. And then Davy Crockett as well became famous, straight up became famous, wrote his book on bear hunting in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee with his pack of hounds. So focusing on this region, I think is really apropos, not only because I live here and I know this history the best, but because this is the most famous history of bear hunters and bear hunting. So I just thought this was a good place for us to start the conversation. So onwards and upwards, we're talking about black bears. For those of you not familiar with bears, you basically have like 3 to 4 types of bears in North America. You got your polar bears, which are the biggest ones, and those are the scariest because they hunt people more than people hunt them. Like they're very, very dangerous. And they live up in the Arctic. Then you have grizzly bears and brown bears. The only real difference I think between grizzly bears and brown bears is one lives on the coast and one doesn't, and one has a big hump on its back and the other one doesn't. But you have grizzly bears and brown bears, and then you have black bears. And black bears are the smallest of the three when you're comparing mature adult animals. And a black bear has a range in size. They can get up to like 700s, like high 700s. I think the record bear was shot on the coast of North Carolina this past year at like 790. So they can get really big, but more often than not, they're probably walking around. A mature black bear is probably walking around in the 350s, maybe up to the 500s for a really big one. But I mean, they can separate from their mom, no longer be a cub, be a bear on its own at like, 150 pounds, which is like the size of a man, basically. So Black bears are in that lower small range, and they proliferate around the whole area. And they're the only bears that are native to this region and the mountains. So there's no brown bears or grizzly bears or anything here. It's just black bears that live here. And their diets consist of, they're omnivores. So people kind of know that. And what it creates in bears is that they usually go with the food sources that are the easiest. So being an omnivore animal and living in a temperate climate like here in North Carolina, Tennessee, where the winters aren't very harsh, bears don't hibernate. Instead, they basically just continue to eat acorns and roots, berries, dead carcasses that they come across, fish, stuff like that. Obviously, your neighbor's trash if you live in a place with bears. They try to focus on the minimal amount of exertion to get calories. So the idea of a bear like chasing a deer through the forest it's not that it doesn't happen. It's just bears prefer the easy route to getting calories over the hard route. So a lot of the bears in this region you'll find kind of focus their energies on berries, roots, other plant life, acorns, things along those lines, and very rarely are actually hunting stuff. You get coastal bears, they're a little bit different because they don't have as much variety on plant life. They are usually doing a little bit more fishing and hunting for their food, and then out in the western parts of the region of North America, like, black bears have to, try and get calves off of elk herds when they're calving and stuff like that, just like all the other predators. But here in the mountains, they tend to stick to a more herbivore diet. Now, that's not to say that they won't eat, baby deer fawns or even a grown deer if they can get a good opportunity on it. It's a lot less likely because of how many resources are easily available for the bears to eat that don't require so much exertion. So now that you have a rough idea of what bears around these parts do, and now you know that they don't hibernate, which means that they're unlike their northern and western counterparts, they're eating 12 months out of the year versus their counterparts who are basically sleeping, hibernating, and losing weight for 4 to 6 months out of the year, and then getting back out and eating again to build back up that weight because they know they have to hibernate again. These bears in the southern Appalachian region are not on that cycle. They're constantly eating basically, so oftentimes they do get quite big. So understanding that, I want to get into the history of hunting now because that's what I do. And so the history of this region starts with the Cherokee, as it should. And I'm dropping a box. Professionals. The history of this region when it comes to bear hunting starts with the Cherokee, as it probably should. They are the natives to this region. This is their historical homeland, so it makes sense. Bears are extremely valuable to Cherokee as well as other native communities for a couple reasons. One is, like deer and elk and other species of animals, their hides are valuable, right? You get these hides. I'm using one right now. It's incredibly warm and comfortable. These hides are invaluable, especially as you're going through winter months and stuff like that. They're thick, they're warm, they're great. So the hide is always, a valuable target and something that they're going after. So you have the bear hide. Then you have the bear meat. And the bear meat is closest to probably pork in our European mindset, in our Eastern United States, normal human being, people who eat a lot of domestic wildlife. If venison is closer to like lamb or goat, and elk is closer to like beef and cattle, bear is closest to pork. And so smoking bear, hams and shoulders and stuff like that over a fire, with all the kind of laced marbling fat that's in there, it would create a very juicy, it's basically barbecue. So the meat is extremely good, very, very tasty. And so that's really beneficial. And then lastly is just the quantity of bear fat. So bears are one of the few species of animal that really get a lot of body fat on their being, right? They're not the only ones, obviously, but they can, like deer are so dry is the terminology, that they have very little body fat on them. And what body fat they do have is very waxy and not easily digestible by humans. Bears are a lot more like pigs. Again, they pack on a lot of fat around their body. That's their energy storage. They produce a lot of fat when they're eating well, and they have a lot of body fat on them. And when you cut, once you've killed a bear and you've cutting away that fat, if you render that fat down, it's a lot like bacon grease. You can cook with it. You can preserve meat in it. I had somebody comment on our previous video about meat storage with bison, and how they would basically use a fat cap, like render down fat, and then pour it over meat in like a pot, and it would basically create an environment that doesn't allow any oxygen into the meat, preserving the meat. And you can do that as well. So bear fat was extremely valuable to Native Americans because it was one of the few ways that they could honestly get a high quantity of fat into their diet. The reason you want to do that is because the human body needs 4 basic things, right? It needs proteins, carbohydrates, amino acids, and fats. Carbohydrates are your corns, beans and squash, right? The traditional 3 sisters that Native Americans all throughout the southeast, northeast grew. That's your carbohydrates, as well as some proteins in the beans and squash. And fish, deer, all the normal things that you're going to go hunt and catch, that's going to provide a lot of your proteins, a lot of your amino acids. But fat is hard to come by. There's a little bit of fat in fish. There's a little bit of fat in like beaver, stuff like that. Some ducks, stuff like that. But if you're looking for a big ticket animal that's going to be able to produce a lot of fat, you're looking for bears, because there aren't any wild hogs native to North America at that time, right? There were some pre-Ice Age, but that doesn't count. We're talking about when the Cherokee are here. And so they don't have wild pigs or anything like that. Bear is the closest thing they have. So they targeted bears aggressively. They targeted bears very aggressively because it was such an imperative food source, right? A bear is worth so much more than a deer because, you can eat just deer all you want, but if all that deer is providing you is proteins, eventually you're going to die because you need carbohydrates or you need fats to balance out that protein. You can die from just eating protein. So you can't just live off of deer, but you can live just off of bear, right? Bear provides enough protein and fat that you could live just off bears. So bears were a big ticket item for the Cherokee, especially pre-contact. And rendered down bear fat would be sold and traded, and a valuable commodity used almost as, a trading, bartering money source. And the way they would hunt bears is as diverse as native communities have always been. And there are definitely methods that have been lost to us and we don't know about. They would probably use similar methods that they would deer and other wild game, which is like drives, get a bunch of guys to basically walk through the woods, make a lot of noise, and push all the animals in one direction, and then have a bunch of hunters sitting in that direction. And as the animals come running by, they can pop them with arrows. Using funneling systems that would basically force the animals to go down certain predictable paths by basically weaving saplings in between trees. The other thing you have to remember is these Cherokee communities are very agricultural and they don't move. They're not migratory very much. They're definitely not like nomadic. And if they live in a valley, basically they live in one little tiny part of the valley in their village, and then they fill the rest of the valley up with corn. And then they grow beans and squash in the hillsides nearby. So, and then you're also thinning out all the trees on the hillsides for all your firewood and your building material. So you've basically created a bait pile, a hunting field bait pile that's going to attract bears and deer and elk and turkeys and everything to you. So you're not having to go very far sometimes to look for them. and bears are going to get into that cornfield at night and just tear it up. So the Cherokee could just traditionally hunt it, knowing that the animals are going to come to this food source, and plan on intercepting them as they go to it or as they come away from it. And then the other method that they might use is a falling log trap, which I've seen them, and it's almost difficult to comprehend in my head a little bit, because you think of a bear as such a massive, strong creature, and you're like, how does a log falling like this far, take out that bear? But wood is shockingly heavy, and it works really well, and has worked really well for centuries. And basically, the idea though is you kind of create like a small, relatively small enclosure by using like rocks or other logs, and you put some bait in it, and then you set a trigger near the bait with a log hanging over it. And so when the bear sticks its head in to get at the bait, it triggers the mechanism, and the log falls down on the bear and like cracks its skull or breaks its spine or just pins the bear down. And then the hunters can come back and get the bear later. And that method is very common up and down the East Coast, and I'm pretty sure it's out west as well. It's very, very normal way to catch bears, and very effective. Very effective, because you don't have to be there. The hunter doesn't actually have to be sitting there with that trap waiting for the bear to go. You can set 5 or 6 of them along, some valley, and then you can go home, and then you come back the next day and just check your traps, and then go home again. So it's a very efficient way to get after those bears. When Europeans come to the Americas, they quickly find that they value the bears for the same reasons that the natives do. They need the hides. The hides go into the fur market trade that we have talked extensively about, but all those hides get shipped back to Europe. They get used in machinery belts and in clothing, fancy clothing for Europeans and all that stuff. So the hide of the bear has value. The meat it's meat. It'll keep you alive, so it's got value in that sense. And then the fat is still very valuable, because domesticated pigs are usually a couple steps behind the true pioneers. And so if you think as like a slow moving lava working its way from the east to the west across the North American continent, the guys at the bleeding edge of that, advancement, the pioneers, your market hunters, your Daniel Boones, your Davy Crockett's, those types of guys, they're all the way over here. And the domesticated hogs are like here. So your supplies of domesticated food and fat from bacon and the normal places that we today get our fat from is not really readily available for the people living on the frontier. And so they have to adapt to the same thing that natives have traditionally done, which is get the bear fat. The bear fat keeps you alive. So they're focused on that as well. And that's when you start seeing some changes in the hunting of bears. So you have Daniel Boone, and Daniel Boone is just a representation of market hunters in general during his time period. So you're talking about like a little bit before the Revolutionary War, and then probably 30-40 years not 30 years after the Revolutionary War. And Daniel Boone's basically in that span hunting throughout Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida. Yes, he went to Florida. All throughout that mountain chain, basically, because at the time that was the frontier. That was the bleeding edge of colonists, and that was where the densest bear populations were. And he was a market hunter for primarily bears, and he would basically go on what is long hunts. And Europeans kind of introduced this concept. Native Americans also did it this way, so it's not uncommon. But basically, they would go off for long periods of time, up to years, right? Sometimes two years, and hunt animals extensively, skin them, take the hides, treat the hides while they're out on the trail, and just keep building up a supply of hides, trading the meat and the fat with local pioneer groups. And then eventually, once they get enough hides together, going back eastward, finding civilization, trading the hides out, and getting a bunch of money. And so that's kind of the process that Daniel Boone introduced, and it was a effective way for young men usually to go out and make a name for themselves, make a profit, earn some money, and it was an effective period. But the downside was the depletion of bear population was rapid, right? The hunters were hammering the bears back, right? So if you're hunting bears, right, we already explained that basically the bear original population density was basically all of North America. As you're bleeding out from the coast of, like, let's say North Carolina, South Carolina, you're decimating bear populations throughout the coastal plains, the Piedmont, into the foothills, into the mountains. And just as quick as you can go, basically just decimating bears back to the coastal towns and sending them off to Europe. Just go and go and go. The swamps near the coast of North Carolina would always hold some bears just because they're so dense and thick. It was hard for hunters to get in there. But for the most part, you're depleted. Like the Piedmont gets completely wiped out all the way up into the mountains. The mountains are so thick and rugged that they never lose their bear populations completely. They stick around. But by the time of Daniel Boone's death, I think that's in the early 1800s. I'd have to look. But by the time of Daniel Boone's death, the North Carolina mountains have been hunted out. There's no real bear population left there for market hunter to really go and make any money on. So then by the time you have Davy Crockett stepping up to the stage, right, which is definitely like 1820s, 1830s, he's hunting throughout basically Tennessee, just the entire state of Tennessee. And by the time Frederick Gerstacker, who wrote a book, he's a German guy who came over and he wrote a book on basically market hunting for bears in North America. And I think he came over in the 1830s, and he was having to go as far as Arkansas to find bears that are in dense enough populations to really support market hunting. So you're going very fast, right? In the span of 50, 60 years, you're eating up states, just decimating bear populations as you go. And when we talk about methods, these guys were trying to be as efficient as possible to get the bears. And so a guy like Daniel Boone, he's famous for kind of going out and solo hunting a lot, basically figuring out what the bears are and then spot stalking up and shooting them. We don't know how often he would have used traps like falling log traps and things along those lines. We know that he spent a lot of time with the Cherokee, and was even possibly adopted by a Cherokee elder, kind of leader of a community at some point. So he would have been very aware of Cherokee hunting practices and their effectiveness. But I think it was somewhere in North Carolina. At one year, Daniel Boone and his family went into a valley and spent the winter there, and he shot over 100 bears in one valley. So whatever method he was using was very effective, but he didn't seem to use dogs. Who would use dogs is Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett used dogs almost exclusively to bear hunt. And his book is full of stories about him basically bear hunting through the mountains and the flatlands of Tennessee with his pack of dogs, and becoming very successful doing it, having a lot of crazy adventures that would make him famous in his lifetime for those stories. Because if you're trying to run for a political position at a place like Tennessee, which is a very rural pioneer area, and a lot of people bear hunt, and you have a lot of funny stories about bear hunting that made you famous, they can relate to you, so they like you. So a lot of Davy Crockett's early fame came from his adventures in Tennessee that he would eventually write down. A lot of it revolved around bear hunting. So Europeans, I don't know if they introduced hunting with dogs. I would imagine natives hunted with dogs. But Europeans famously hunted with dogs. All the way back in Europe, they hunted for boar and bears with dogs. That was a very European way to do things. And it's a very efficient way to do things if you're trying to make money. So Davy Crockett did that. And most bear hunters in the area did that. And as, the market hunting petered out into the, west and then continued on and eventually got shut down in the early 1900s. And, you know, conservationists like Teddy Roosevelt come in and they start putting in place like game laws and hunting seasons and bag limits and tags for hunting big game and all these sorts of things that, to start bringing back the wildlife population. Regions like North Carolina and Tennessee would never stop hunting bears. They would continue the tradition and the practice of hunting bears long after the introduction of hogs, long after, all the laws are passed. They would continue to raise plot hounds and I don't know all the dog breeds, but a lot of different really cool dog breeds. I think blue tick maybe? I don't know. Doesn't matter. They'd raise dogs specifically for bear hunting. There was a steadfast community in North Carolina and Tennessee that never stopped bear hunting. And this is very important because throughout the 1900s, the early 1900s, wildlife populations would hit such a low point that areas that traditionally had tons of deer, tons of bear, tons of elk, tons of wildlife were completely empty, right? There's whole regions in North Carolina, South Carolina's Piedmont, where there were no more turkeys. There were no more deer, right? And reintroduction projects had to occur to reintroduce those animal populations and then build them back up to a sustainable rate that, hunters could then start going out and hunting them under careful regulation from the state. Here in the mountains, the bear population had never gone away. They had never gotten deleted. They had certainly become much smaller, but they had never gone away. And so there was always still some bear hunting to be done, just a lot less than there used to be traditionally. And so these bear hunting communities clung on and kind of cling to life and keep up these traditional practices of how they would, hunt bears, how they would raise the dogs to hunt bears, how they would still render down the fat, still cook with the meat, still take the hides. They continue to pass that traditional history on down. And so by the time you hit the late 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, basically our modern day, there starts to be a lot of pushback in the general community, not the hunting community necessarily, although some hunting community people. There's general pushback against hunting bears with hounds. It's kind of gained this viewpoint by a lot of people who aren't a part of the culture, who don't understand conservation or anything along those lines. They just see an animal getting chased by a pack of dogs and they're like, that's horrible, oh my God. And, a very natural reaction, and I understand. What those people don't understand, obviously, is the history and the cultural significance that, goes all the way back to before the founding of this country, where this has been a very traditional practice of hunting. And what's interesting is the bear populations in these areas today have bounced back since the early 1900s to such a point that most of these counties are overpopulated with bears. I think bears keep a rough range from each other. They're not like deer. They don't usually travel in big packs. They don't like to be near each other. There's a lot of territorial fighting. And there are some parts of North Carolina where you have 4 bears every square mile in that county. And that's too many bears. It's too overpopulated for that region. And, you would expect these bears to migrate out of these dense regions and into more open areas that, traditionally would have had bear populations. But these bears are kind of hemmed in now by interstates and suburbs and cities and, all these different man-made constructions that have kind of limited their ability to expand their population back out to their natural habitat, their natural range. They can't really do that anymore. They have to basically stay in these underdeveloped areas of the Appalachian Mountains and live here where they still have their natural environment and the resources available to them and enough forest and coverage that they don't have to constantly be interacting with people. Because, you know, everybody wants the bears to live happily and freely, but once the bear is in your backyard, hanging out on your porch, eating out your trash and, you know, killing your dog, all of a sudden that bear needs to die. And the reality is what you need to do is use hunters and people who like to pursue these animals and use these animals properly to continue traditions like, you know, eating them and you know, using their hides for purpose. You use those people to manage the bear population so that the bear populations don't get overblown to where the bears have to spread out into suburbs and cities and towns and mess with people. So you keep the bear population artificially small to fit the artificially small habitat that they have available to live in. And when people attack things like bear hunting with hounds, what I personally think you should do in those situations is you need to basically say if it's a traditional practice of hunting that culturally people have traditionally done in that region, and it seems to be working well with the management practices of like the DNR and, you know, other biologists basically monitoring the populations, and the populations aren't suffering, right? Populations are going up or they're staying the same, or they're getting into the range that they need to be for that habitat. If that's working and your traditional hunting practices are working in conjunction with that, and it's the method that people have always done in that region, then you should keep it, right? Nothing's broken about it, so don't try to come in and fix it. I think it's a different conversation if you're trying to introduce hunting with hounds to a brand new region because you're adding this new component, and you don't know necessarily how the ecology and the environment's going to react to having a bunch of hounds running through it, chasing bears. But especially if you have a region that traditionally this has been going on for a very long time and it has been working for a very long time for everyone, I don't think you should mess with that system. So that's about it. That's my little rant about the hunting of bears and the history of hunting bears in this region. And it's kind of just my prep work for my bear hunt with hounds here in the mountains in October. And I'm really excited to be able to film that experience and go and do it for the first time. I've never hunted with hounds for bears before. And I'm really excited to be able to take you guys with me and kind of document the experience and kind of see what it's all about. And when it comes to bear hunting with hounds, I know that I support people being able to do it, especially in their traditional areas where it's always been done, right? Since the 1600s, right? People have been hunting for bears with hounds in this region, right? So I don't think there's any problem with them doing it. Whether or not I'm going to take to it well and be comfortable with the process is to be seen. But I think so far I've really loved the history of it. I've really loved learning about it. And I'm really excited to go out there and do it. So stay tuned. Some fun things are going to be happening.